right now. I'm going to read verses 8 through 16, and then we're going to talk about that. This is some of the things that we talked about last time, but we're about to start on Abraham. So, verse 8 says, "By faith." Remember, this is the chapter that we started a long time ago. Actually, Jonathan started it because I was out one Wednesday, and it started out talking about faith because obviously that is the problem right now with those believers that he's writing to, the Jewish Messianic believers, and he is going back and showing examples of the kind of faith that they need and what it takes to walk in that faith as he goes through this chapter. And remember, he's already dealt with Enoch. Well, he first dealt with Abel, then he dealt with Enoch, and then he dealt with Noah, and we talked about that last time. And I did want to, before we read that about Abraham, I did want us to look at this. Remember, Wiersbe kind of gave us this definition: faith is confident obedience to God's word in spite of circumstances. And that is exactly, if you think about that and you keep that definition in mind and you study through this chapter, it just fits. I mean, every time it mentions somebody, this is what you see. Confident obedience. So somebody can talk about having all this faith, and we have the word of faith movement and all this kind of stuff where they've kind of hijacked the meaning of, at least the biblical meaning of faith. But when you look at faith in the Bible, this is what it is. And it doesn't matter what things look like around you. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. Basically, it's trusting, it's believing that God exists and trusting God that when He says something, we do it. Isn't that logical? I mean, really, if He is all-knowing and all-present and all-powerful, He spoke everything into existence. He's the one that controls all things, and ultimately He's the one that we will give account to and live in eternity with. If we really believe that by faith, then we will trust and obey. That's what we'll do. That's the way we'll live our life. And if we read something and we learn this is the way we're to be, like we just finished up Sunday night, we finished up the Sermon on the Mount, and there's all kinds of things in there that tell us how we're to live. And so if we're going to walk by faith, we're going to look at what the Sermon on the Mount says, and that's the way we're going to live. And so that's what these people did. We talked about Noah. Very possibly Noah had never seen rain, because early on it said there's a mist came up from the ground. So that's a possibility. He probably had never seen a large ship. Now they may have had boats. I think they probably did on the ocean and maybe in the rivers that it talks about. But but all of a sudden God says there's going to be a worldwide flood, and you need to build an ark, and you need to build it this size. And during this time, as we talked about Peter, Peter said that he was going out and preaching righteousness, which probably meant he was going out and telling people God exists, and God has said there's going to be a flood. He's going to send rain on the earth, and the only salvation is to get in that boat. No takers except for his family, But he had all of those things. If you looked at circumstances in a situation like that, you would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. God's going to cover the whole earth with water. I mean, how is he going to do that? This mist is not going to do that. You know, if we started to think like some scientists do, and it's just what we see, you're not going to do that. But faith is believing that God exists, and He's a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. That's what we've seen. And we have confidence. If He says something, it's going to happen. And if He says we're to live a certain way, and we do that, He's going to reward us. So why should we not walk by faith? And so we talked about that. And tonight he talks about Abraham. Verse 8, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out. Listen very carefully to what he's saying. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Remember, not that long ago, we talked about Abraham and Ur of the Chaldees. You remember that? And Ur of the Chaldees was actually a pretty nice city. It was right on the Euphrates River. There was a place where ships could pull up. They had commerce and trade. It was a very well-developed city, affluent for its day. And there's some indication that Abraham probably was part of a prominent family. It is interesting, his uncle was named Haran, and one of the major cities there that they stopped at was named Haran. That could have been after his brother, or it could have been after a lot of times they had, father was named something, a grandfather, and then the son was named the same name. So anyway, so he leaves all of that behind, and look what it says. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. We remember, that's when it was. We recently, when we looked at the Israel thing, we looked at Ur of the Chaldees and all that kind of stuff in the Abrahamic covenant. Well, here, we know that in Genesis, the Abrahamic covenant is given to Abraham, that is passed on to Isaac, and then is passed on to Jacob, and eventually the 12 tribes that developed into Israel. So think about this. What if you had the idea that many people think about Christianity today? Well, if I trust Christ and I live well, He's going to bless me. I mean, this is the implication. He's going to bless me, and I'm going to have all I need all the time and what I want to, that type of thing. And when trouble comes to people like that, they think, what have I done? If Abraham lived that way, he would have said, wait a minute. I had all of this in Ur. I'm going back to Ur. I mean, there's a bunch of pagans living around here. Of course, he was a pagan too, until he responded to God and put faith in Him. And he believed in God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. But these people live in tents. We had a nice house back in Ur, But as we're going to see here, that's not what he was looking at, because faith in God looks beyond the present circumstances. Look at what it says. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Now, what is interesting about this is, remember, this is, we believe Abraham probably lived 2000 BC, around there. Where did that revelation come from? Jonathan? I mean, where did the revelation come from that indicated to Abraham that there was something, not just the land that they called him to, but he's looking beyond that. Because remember, he never really inherited all of that land, did he? No, he lived with all those people that they went back later to flush out of that area to make that Israel. And so did Isaac and Jacob, by the way. All those years passed. They didn't get that land as an inheritance. Well, it was ultimately they will, you know, but he's not thinking, man, I get down there and you talk about I'm going to build something even more fabulous, and I'm going to do this, that, and the other. He was looking beyond that. I mean, where is that? Where is the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God? And how did he even know about that? God would have had to give him insight. Have you ever thought about that, Jonathan? I mean, we know, because I don't remember anywhere in Genesis that it talks about he had that revelation. That's what I'm talking about. But also, if you read Job, which would have been written about that same time and maybe even a little earlier, Job has insight, and you think, he had no document to read to know that. He had to be getting divine revelation from God, and he probably did, you know, because God eventually talked to him. He got some revelation. Some of it he really probably didn't want, you know. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? God said to him. Sometimes we want God to talk to us, and sometimes we don't want God to talk to us. We should have never done what we did, you know. But this reveals that even though by faith he went to that land, he was looking beyond that to a place where God lived. That's what he was thinking about. And how that all fits together with what his belief system beforehand, I don't know. I don't know. We know was it in Joshua 24:2? You know, we learn things later about Abraham that's not revealed in Genesis 2. For instance, for instance, in Joshua 24:2, it talks about Abraham, and it says his father, where they lived, they served other gods. In other words, he was involved in whatever gods that they worshipped back then in Ur of the Chaldees. It had degraded pretty quickly, actually, after the flood. Remember, about 100 years later, you had the Tower of Babel. And when the confusion of languages occurred, they went down those rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And that's why some people call that the cradle of civilization, and it really was after the flood. But they had already, even though they had this information that God had just destroyed the world, and then they even had the revelation that he confused the languages, even those miracles didn't convince them that there's one God, and it's the one that Shem and others told them about. So in Acts 7:2, when Stephen is speaking to Israel, it says, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. And so there's a record of the fact that not only did God just speak to him, but apparently he appeared to him. And I don't know what that looked like. It doesn't tell us, but it could be, Abraham had Jesus Christ pre-incarnate appear to him. Remember, he appeared to him along with two other angelic beings. And when you read that, it's very obvious that is God. And so, God apparently appeared to him, probably in some kind of form, probably as the angel of the Lord. That's what Christ is called in the Old Testament many times, and called him into a relationship there, and gives him the promise of the Abrahamic covenant. And so, but all along the way, even though Abraham obviously made mistakes, all along the way, Abraham walked by faith, and when God would tell him to do something, he would do it. That's biblical faith. Isn't that a far cry from the emphasis that many times we put on the faith that initiates salvation? Because when the writer of Hebrews wanted to talk about faith, he talked about an enduring faith, a faith that is evident from what people do. And I think probably we should emphasize that more. Again, as y'all know, I think historically that was one of the great mistakes of the Second Great Awakening, because we became so obsessed with some kind of initial decision. But yet, many of you have lived long enough to know that many people that you saw make some kind of decision, it didn't seem to be enduring faith. Now, what we can't look in the heart, we don't know for sure, but it's like, if this is faith, walking by faith, God tells you something and you do it. That's not what that looks like that we're talking about, this initial decision. If that initial decision is correct, or is a valid decision, is a by faith decision, then it should look like Abraham's. It should look like Noah's. In other words, God tells you to do something and you do it. In other words, the process that Paul challenges us to in Romans 12, 1 and 2, should be the normal Christian life, not the abnormal Christian life. And we live in a day where that's almost abnormal for somebody to get saved and they just keep growing and growing and growing, and you see a maturity that occurs in a transformation. Abraham's faith, that's what he did. And so in verse 10, did I read verse 10 yet? Let's see here. Yes. So maybe I didn't read verse 10. Give me just a second. Let me find it here. I've got my notes confused here. Yes. So what? Now, obviously, Abraham wouldn't have had all these details, but the Bible gives us detail about what Abraham was looking forward to. Some city that God was the architect to, but we don't get that revelation until John wrote it down in the Revelation. Turn back to Revelation 21. The verse 2 of 21, and this is, chapter 20 is all about, the first part is all about the messianic reign, 1,000-year messianic reign. Then there's a rebellion for those who entered in their physical bodies, or probably their children, certainly their children, at the end of this 1,000 years. And that's obviously immediately put down when fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And then there's the white throne judgment, we call it, at the end of 20. And then 21 starts to talk about eternity. And in chapter 21, verse 2, it says, where John was seeing this new heaven and new earth after the other one passed away, And by the way, if you've ever wondered when that passing away occurs, it's probably referenced in 2011, where it says, "Then I saw," this is a possibility anyway, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them." So that, and Peter talks about it burning up in intense heat and all that kind of thing. So that's probably when this happened, that it passed away. And then verse 2 it says, "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband." And then verses 9 through 27 give us a great detail of that. So if you want to read that later, we're already at 7 o'clock, so we're not going to have time to read that. Sarah did the same thing, right? Now, again, when you read about Sarah did laugh, right? I mean, 90 years old and I'm going to have a child? Right. You know, she did laugh, and Jesus called her on it, or the angel of the Lord, or what are you going to call him? Pre-incarnate Christ called her on it. No, you did laugh. You know, sometimes that's a very loving thing to do, right? Point out to our brother or sister, or have it pointed out to us that we've lied or we've sinned, and we try to talk through it. And we talked about that the other day, rebuking. Rebuking is supposed to be common among believers, but we don't see it very often. Nobody wants to offend anybody, you know, although it's really an expression of love. So now Abraham had laughed too. I don't know if you remember that, but he's not called on that. So contextually, we don't know if that's glee or just unbelief, laughing like, really? I'm 100 years old and I did that? Really? Hey, this is not G at this point. It's maybe PG, okay? Yeah. I think he was looking at himself and saying, "No, that's not happening, Lord." That's right. I know by 100 you'd know better than to laugh at your wife. But I mean, even as long as they lived, the scripture is very clear that by then Sarah was menopausal. She could not have children normally. But when God said they would have children, they believed that they would have children, and of course they did. That's real faith. That's real faith. And it says all of these died in faith. I'm just going to read the last section of this about Abraham to 16, and then we'll talk about this next time. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, they saw by faith, in the sense that they believed that was going to happen. God had made a promise, and they had seen God promise other things, and it happened. So they knew that city existed, and they knew someday they would be in it. And having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. We forget that, don't we? As believers, we are strangers and exiles on this earth. This is not our home. As the old song said, we're just a passing through. We really are. And it's so much easier to live a godly life if we remind ourselves of that often, and read Hebrews 11 often. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. He has prepared a city for them. I think of, when I read that about not ashamed of, I think of that passage in 1 John about Jesus appearing and somebody think it's translated shrinking back because of the way they've lived, I'm assuming, in that context. So, you want to live with the faith of Abraham, Moses, Enoch. You hear or you listen to what is taught, and you live that. And by the way, we do have an advantage over them, I believe, theologically, because we have God living in us. You know, John said, even to the disciples, and I think this is all the Old Testament saints. The Spirit of God is with you, but He will be in you. And so in this dispensation, we have, you say, well, gosh, I'm not as, I can't live like Abraham did. He was an incredible man of faith. We actually have a greater advantage to live a godly life if we depend on the Lord. We have the strength of the Spirit of God in us. So our witness should be greater. No pressure. Jonathan, can you close us with a word of prayer?